So we're ready for our panel now with Todd and Deirdre. I hope you got something out of that short Safety Futures clip and some ideas for your own organisation. So first question, and I want to direct this to Sydney first, and then Sydney might hand straight to Todd. One of the principles of human and organisational performance is that context and systems drive behaviour. So how can we overcome these things like free market forces and profit and shareholder return and short-term thinking, which are often at odds with these approaches around investment in organisational slack and resilience and slowing down to improve and not treating workers like replaceable, disposable cogs in this industrial machine. So how can we overcome these forces? How can we create a different context to drive a different behaviour? Sydney, and then when you're done, please invite responses from Todd and Deirdre.
Thank you, Dave. The observation is, of course, very apt, and it's interesting to reflect on the fact that this is a point that even our human factors forebears have made after the wave of behaviorism, behavior-based safety coming out of the thinking of the 1920s and 1930s. Human factors said, well, actually, context matters. These errors and this performance, this human performance, is driven by context, and you can find the relationships in a very rigorous and almost lawful way in how context is going to shape human performance. So that insight is well embedded in the scholarship and the literature and the history of how we do safety. On the other hand, what we haven't reflected on, as you just did in your spiel, is the fact that this also impacts leaders in organizations. Their behavior, their incentives are driven by the context within which they work. What we have learned from behaviorism and behavior-based safety is that you cannot change behavior by changing behavior, right? And we've quipped about this in various ways, right? You put up a poster, you tell people to try harder, right? Or as Todd said, you tell them to care more. And that is essentially changing behavior by changing behavior, which doesn't work. And so behaviorism sort of died as a meaningful, incredible school of psychology back in the 1950s. So the fact that we're still talking about it already shows how behind the literature we are. But what that suggests, though, relative to the leadership, is we can only change that if we can change the context in which they operate. That is, how are they being held accountable? If they're being held accountable for quarterly results of low numbers of negatives, then that's what they're going to show, right? And so this is what we need to change with each other: clients versus contractors, boards versus management, and even regulators, although they're not supremely interested. It's mostly market forces that drive these sorts of short-term reporting requirements. Changing that by, for example, changing how you present it in the final annual report. Already maybe one small step, right? Show a lot of good stuff and the capacities that you're building, and then toward the back, have the uncle, in the family that you don't really want to talk about. You want to hide them in the basement. And those are the numbers of negatives that somehow reporting relationships still ask you to show. But dim the light on it, as John Green likes to say. Dim the light on it. I think stepping away from the context that drives that behavior, that is counter what we wish to achieve, Dave, is the way to go. I'll ball this to Todd first. Todd, your reflections on this, my friend.
With everything you just said, because I think it was really quite poignant. And I think the challenge we have is the realization that we've not spent a lot of but collectively organizations don't spend a lot of time creating an environment where leaders can be very successful. And they really do provide incentives that actually drive them towards exactly what Sydney talked about. The big question, and I think it's kind of a board level question, is if we can get the board interested in understanding operational excellence, kind of the grand operations differently, then we'll get the board to ask different questions, which in turn takes different questions to the leadership suite, which in turn drives different questions. But this is a big one. It's a hard one to change. It was interesting. Deirdre, you should jump in on this, because one thing that I found really interesting is that if you can get them to understand risk in financial frames, then that really helps sort of bridge the gap a little. But I don't know, that's just one I'd toss out there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I've been spending a lot of time talking to my board, and I think we've spent years and years and years talking to the board around these lagging metrics and around risk in a particular context. And we've actually fed the board the things that we're actually now trying to unpick. And so they're actually really wed to it because we've been giving it to them. And I think part of our challenge as professionals is that now we're in a place where I think we have to have a different kind of conversation with our boards. They want us to have this conversation, but I think sometimes we don't feel as equipped to have it, or we might get challenged on certain things and then maybe we don't feel as confident or as comfortable as we could do having those conversations. So I think education of the board through what we present to them with the data. So I think storytelling about risk around what our people are doing and around some of the context around how we're learning is helping to shape a different kind of dialogue, and the numbers kind of come second. So as we've been having those conversations in our business, the conversation around the number is kind of almost like, oh yeah, okay, well that's a bit boring. Let's actually talk about the interesting stuff, which is about risk and you know how we're recovering capacity and learning. So yeah, but it's tough. And you know, I go to the board once every 3 months, so you get an opportunity once every 3 months to talk about this, so you've really got to take your opportunity.
Thanks, Todd, Deirdre, and Sid. Another question now. We might have just partially answered it, but there's a couple of questions about the story I told about the floods, but also where Todd talked about striking while the iron's hot. And so what would your advice be? Maybe we'll start with Todd. What would you practically advise safety professionals to do to be locking in more resilient actions and processes and a priority on those things that have been introduced and maybe working during COVID, so that they're not lost when we revert back? What would you be advising our 1,000 people around the world to be doing in their organisations today to try to create some stickiness around these things?
One thing that comes to mind almost immediately is there's a real need to talk about the successes that happened during this recent COVID. It's not even recent, the COVID activity that's going on now. I'm not sure we've actually deliberately talked about where we adapted, where we made success happen, and then the much more interesting sort of how around that happened. And I think that opens up a conversation that people are really willing to have at pretty much every level of the organization. I really think we should do some after action learning. And what scares me is that I think a lot of companies aren't taking even a moment to review what happened, and this potential learning will escape them. And they're just going to be overcome by normal operational events again. And so I think we have to carefully create a time to have this conversation and to talk about what we learned, what was good, what was bad, where we could be better, where success happened and why it happened. That makes a huge difference.
Did I change glasses?
Should I say over? Over?
Roger that, Todd. Todd, could you please share some best practices for managing uncertain risk?
With the quick answer is that risk is very dynamic, and so we could make a pretty good argument that all risk kind of falls into the uncertain category. It ebbs and flows, moves in and out. And I think we do our best to understand that we build processes, systems, and practices that understand the adaptive nature of workers, and that we're constantly managing and thinking about the control part of the equation. So we're ready for failure. David Woods just talked to me recently, and he's really fixated on the phrase "hedge your bets," which because this is David Woods, he of course calls it bet hedging, which is so funny to me because nobody on earth calls it bet hedging except for David Woods. But this idea of hedging your bets is a really interesting idea, and I think that's really where I would go with that discussion.
Thanks, Todd. I think hedging your bets is a good way of looking at it. As David Woods would always say, that capacity to, and you mentioned earlier, Todd, that capacity to reframe your model of the world and reframe your model of risk as new information comes to hand is probably one of the most important capacities we can have. And Sydney, for more than a decade, has been talking about keeping the conversation of risk alive, even when everything appears to be safe. So I think those concepts are really, really important. We're going to go to a break shortly. Before we do that, I'd like to wrap up the panel just by inviting maybe Deirdre first and then Todd to just leave the audience with some closing remarks. So Deirdre, back to you.
Hey, I think my closing remark is that as a practitioner, this stuff is complex. It's hard. There's a lot of information out there, and understanding the context of the organisation that you're working in is absolutely key. Ask for help and give some things a go. If it doesn't work, you're kind of living the values and you're living the principles about, people make mistakes. Get up and have another go at something and start. Because if you don't start, you'll procrastinate and you'll keep waiting for something to happen so that you start something. So that's probably what my advice would be. Start somewhere, and there's people everywhere that will help you.
Thanks, Deirdre. Todd, your great advice coming through on the screen, might I add, mate. I really appreciate you letting me know that I was picking my nose before. So thank you.
I wanted to get that out for you.
Thanks for just telling me that and not everyone else.
Yeah, no one else saw that, so you're fine, right? So thanks for doing this, you guys. Thanks for taking the time and the effort, because this is a lot of work. You can tell just by the way the technical guys. There's a lot going on here. My closing remarks is the opportunity to just talk about these things with each other is invaluable, and we don't get to do it enough because we're overcome by normal work every single day, making stuff happen. Thank you for the conversation. Keep having them.
And thank you, Todd. And Sydney, your thoughts before we go to a quick break.
I love them both.
Thank you.
We love you.
Thank you. Probably the only time, listeners around the world, probably the only time you'll get a 4-word answer out of Professor Decker. So you have witnessed something monumental here today at the Forge Work Safety Innovation Summit. Thank you, Sydney. You know I love you. And now we are going to go to a short break.